This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Assalamu alaikum. Oh, you're supposed to say it back. It's how we say hello. Wa alaikum assalam. I think the tragedy really is that Osama bin Laden died a middle-aged American man. And the true punishment for hatred really is that eventually you grow to become the thing you despise the most. And so there was Osama locked indoors, watching home movies on TV, shouting at his television screen, supposedly with a secret stash of illicit reading material by his bedside table, and a house full of a surly family. And he did die then, the American middle-aged death, which is perhaps how the SEALs found him. He'd become one of them. And we'll get back to him in a minute, so don't worry. I haven't forgotten. It's an honor to be here with you today opening the 2011 Sydney Writers' Festival, though perhaps a more dubious privilege to be called upon to speak about nervous breakdowns, which seem to be the natural order of the day. That's almost a universal condition. Who isn't having a nervous breakdown right about now? And it's certainly not just Pakistan. Libya, the country has just become the West's fourth battleground after Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Muammar Gaddafi has just become a soldier again after some downtime buying shares in football teams and financial newspapers. And the West is arming the rebels to the teeth, without particularly bothering to ask who in fact the rebels are. France, and can I just say that it seems fitting that the head of the IMF would turn out to be a rapist. France, they've just taken bigotry dynastic with Marine Le Pen replacing her father as the head of the French National Front. They've passed laws mandating what women can and cannot wear, which is very Saudi Arabia of them. And they have a president who takes counsel from Bernard-Henri Lévy, which alone should qualify them for some kind of emeritus nervous breakdown award. Maybe it's the very concept of nation states that induces nervous breakdowns. And we know that nation states at the moment are facing attacks on multiple fronts, from multinationals, which seek to replace the power of the state, from fluid immigration and how it is that we begin to think of our citizens and what makes them citizens, and from hyper-increased connectivity, which means, God help us, that Facebook has a population 20 times the size of Australia. But this is about Pakistan, at least that's what people keep telling me, a country that is perpetually on the verge of nervously breaking down. It is the world's sixth most populous country, the world's fifth largest nuclear state, and has, depending on who you ask, the seventh or the fifth largest army in the world. Barack Obama has publicly called us a cancer. Madeleine Albright is slightly more polite. To her, we're just an international migraine. And Hillary Clinton, who knows something about the subject, frequently begins most of her thoughts on Pakistan with, "It's not an easy relationship, but." And Salman Rushdie at the moment is very cross and wants us declared, all 180 million of us, a terrorist state, for something that really most of us at least didn't know. I know what perhaps you want me to say, or what you think I'm going to say, which is that our nervous breakdown has something to do with Islam, or that it's somehow because of or connected to Islam. But it's not. It's about a fundamental lack of justice, an absence of transparency, and overwhelming violence conducted and condoned by the state. According to the Pew Research Center, the percentage of Pakistanis satisfied with their country has fallen impressively over the years. 39% in 2007, 25% the year after, and 9% in 2010. You get the picture. St. Augustine said that in the absence of justice, what is sovereignty but organized robbery? And perhaps nowhere is this more true than in Pakistan today. 3 years ago, the current government, led by President Asif Zardari, passed a law odiously called the National Reconciliation Ordinance, which erased 20 years' worth of corruption charges against politicians, bankers, and bureaucrats, and included the very large print that would make it virtually impossible to file future charges of graft or any misconduct against sitting parliamentarians. Some months after this law was passed, I was visiting a former justice, Nasser Aslam Zahid, who was the Chief Justice of the Sindh High Courts and now runs the women's and juvenile jails in Karachi. And he told me of a recent case they'd had of 2 young boys, age 11 and 12, who'd recently been brought in to the prison for stealing the metal bolt off a gate. And they stole this bolt off the gate in front of the man whose gate it was, in the hopes that they could sell it for something like 100 rupees, 120 rupees, which is negligible. I mean, it's maybe an Australian dollar, if that. And he asked them, he said, well, why would you do that? Why would you take the risk for such little gain? Why would you do that? And they said, well, we heard of this law that says that thieves don't have to actually spend any time in jail. And he told them, he said, well, you're going to have to steal a lot more before that applies to you. So it's probably not a coincidence that this law was passed under the stewardship of a president who, under his wife's first term, was known as Mr. 10%, and during her second term was known as Mr. 50%, and now, during his own government, has been rechristened as Mr. 110%. The last time this government was in power, Transparency International listed Pakistan as the world's second most corrupt country. Nigeria was the first, and the joke was that we had paid them off to take the fall. You laugh, but you never know. Corruption means something in Pakistan, and what it means is this. It means that we are a nuclear-armed state that missed our millennium goals to eradicate polio. And we didn't miss those goals because we don't have doctors or because we don't have the medical know-how. We missed those goals because we didn't have the electricity to run the refrigerators. So it's a nuclear-armed state that can't work fridges. Keep in mind also that this is a country that has weaseled some $20 billion in American aid money over the last decade. And this is a country that is supposed to be a rich country. We have oil reserves, around 300-odd million barrels of oil. We have billions of cubic feet worth of gas reserves. We have the 5th largest copper mines in the world. We have coal, we have emeralds, we have diamonds, and we technically grow the food that we need to feed our people. And yet, we continue to beg for aid. And so the causes of our nervous breakdown are connected. The rulers are corrupt, the price of basic foodstuffs skyrockets, as feudal landlords and industrialists, who are our presidents and our prime ministers and our ministers of state, hoard basic foodstuffs like sugar and wheat, which is now sold above international prices in Pakistan. And there is a national bloodletting. This is a country consumed by violence, as it were. And in the last 9 months, the hundreds of bodies of Baloch activists who had been disappeared in the thousands, a sinister byproduct of our country's engagement in the war on terror, have been turning up on the outskirts of the province, in ditches, bearing marks of extreme torture and force. There is, and this is, I think, the crux of it, a fundamental lack of justice in Pakistan. And nowhere, or maybe recently this has been most obvious in the case of Mukhtar Mai and the Supreme Court's ruling in her case. I'm sure most of you know who Mai is, but I'll tell you very briefly. In 2002, Mukhtar Mai, who was an illiterate woman from the southern Punjabi village of Mirawala, was gang raped on the order of a tribal jirga. And she was gang raped as punishment for her brother's impudence. Shakur, her 12-year-old brother, had been found to have been flirting with a girl from another tribe. And for this, his sister, for this egregious crime really, his sister was not only gang raped, but she was paraded around the town as a warning. And Shakur, 12-year-old Shakur himself, was sodomized. Nobody came to Mai's defense. Nobody stood up to protect her as this was happening. Nobody said a word until 6 days later, the imam of the local mosque, a man called Maulana Abdul Razak, spoke to his congregation about what had happened and had urged his flock to go to the authorities and report what had happened. He said that those who had harmed Mai had committed the most heinous sin against Islam, and that it was their duty to protect her. It was also this mosque official, this religious man, who was the first to approach a journalist about Mai's case, and that journalist would be the first to tell the world about what had happened to her. And some 2 days after he spoke to his mosque, charges were filed against 14 men. That was the easy part. For the next 9 years, Mukhtar Mai's case bounced around from courts to courts in Pakistan. It went from the Lahore High Court to the Federal Sharia Court and landed up in the Supreme Court, which only just weeks ago acquitted and released all of the men involved in her gang rape. The presiding judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Saqib Nasir, wondered out loud on 2 occasions during the proceedings whether Mai had gone through all the trouble of filing criminal charges against her rapists simply because she was annoyed that none of them had proposed to her afterwards. This failing of justice is a large part of what constitutes our nervous breakdowns in Pakistan. And the question is perhaps, then, what do we do about it? And the solutions to problem states are never found in 30-second answers, in those answers that start with only democracy or only freedom of speech. Pakistan is a young country. It's only 64 years old, and nation building takes time. It's about sustained incremental changes that are carried forward by ordinary people, by ordinary men and women, not by martyrs and not by generals. But the problem with developing countries, and certainly with Pakistan at the moment, is that every pundit out there has a 500-word answer for what we should do. And the New York Times alone prints at least 2 of these a day. And is perhaps the reason why Thomas Friedman is so gainfully employed after all these years. The cure for cancer, since we're talking about cancer, isn't one thing. It's hundreds of things, hundreds of little things, and decades of work. And there are other failings, certainly, that coincide with Pakistan's, and a discussion on nervous breakdowns would be incomplete without a look at the dysfunctional relationship between Pakistan and its best friend/enemy, the United States of America, whose current nervous breakdown is almost as hysterical as our own. It's probably not surprising that in this era of themed wars, war on terror, war of terror, war on drugs, that new wars come tailor-made with ready-made outrage. But the insidious expansion of old wars doesn't seem to. So before Barack Obama begins a drone war against Pakistan, he doesn't need to go to Congress and he doesn't need to meet the press. He simply just does it. And for our part, we've lost the codes to properly articulate our outrage. A 2010 United Nations report on targeted killings found that America was the most prolific user of targeted killings as a weapon of war. And frighteningly found that in the 8 years of the Bush White House, unmanned predator drones were used, largely, it must be said, against Pakistan, a total of 45 times. In the first year of President Obama's White House alone, in 2000,